In this video, I will describe how to calculate and interpret an odds ratio in the context of a case control study. In a case control study, researchers sample cases or people with the disease outcome and controls or people without the disease outcome. The researchers then measure and compare the likelihood that an exposure occurred between the cases and controls. At the end of the study, we can use a 2x2 table, like the one shown here, to calculate an odds ratio, which compares the extent of exposure in the cases to the controls. Say we conduct a study and get the following numbers. For the odds ratio, we compare the odds of having the exposure in the cases to the odds of having the exposure in the controls. To get the odds of the exposure among cases, we start by calculating the probability of having the exposure among cases, which is 0.6. Then the probability of not having the exposure is 0.4. To get the odds of exposure, we divide the probability of having the exposure by the probability of not having the exposure to get 1.5. Among the controls, our probability of having the exposure is 0.4. Our probability of not having the exposure is 0.6. The odds of exposure is 0.4 divided by 0.6, which equals 0.67. Our odds ratio is the ratio of odds of exposure in the case group to odds of exposure in the control group. In this case, the odds ratio is 2.24. We would interpret this to mean that the odds of exposure in the cases is 2.24 times as great or 124% greater than the odds of exposure in the controls. An odds ratio of 1 means there is no difference in the odds of exposure between cases and controls. And an odds ratio less than 1 means the odds of exposure in the cases is less than the odds of exposure in the controls.